In August 1933, Jimmy Gralton, a Leitrim farmer, was arrested and deported to America. His story is part of the story of Ireland in the 1920s and 30s.
He upset them with his ideas, and they didn't like those socialist ideas.
That he was a bad man, that he was a danger to God and to all the things that God stood for and wanted.
He was born in 1886 in Efrona, about 6 miles from Carrick-on-Shannon, and he was always a brilliant boy and a good student. He went to Master Degnan in Deported, and he was a good student, and he left school at 14. He went to work in Carrick-on-Shannon in a shop owned by Owen McGann as an apprentice, and he was very badly paid there and badly fed and everything. He couldn't understand when he came home and saw this clock to Owen McGann, because he says he never fed anyone or paid them, and he couldn't know why they put up a clock to a man like that. He worked in America then as a nice man, deliver nice, and he worked for Bond Bread and different jobs. And he came back to Ireland then in 1921, the time of there was trouble here. There was no government here.
Like many who were born and reared in rural Leitrim at the turn of the century, lack of opportunity and grinding poverty eventually led to emigration. For those remaining, migratory work in Scotland for 4 or 5 months of the year was common.
They had to go to Scotland then for the Toddy Hokan in the fall, and the boys had to stay at home from school to help the mothers do the work, and they got no education hardly, and he didn't like this. He saw this poverty, and he didn't like it, and he thought if they had another bigger farm of land, they'd be able to make a living on it.
I did know one man in that area. Jimmy Bryan was his name. And he had done 40 years over and back to Scotland. He lived on about 3.5 acres of land. He had a family of about 5 or 6. And he travelled across for 40 years. And the last year he went, he brought his 2 sons with him and got them going on the methods of work over in Scotland, and we returned the 3 of them, and he didn't go there anymore. They went from that on and stayed in Scotland, didn't return.
Gralton returned from America in 1921, just weeks before the truce which led to the provisional government 6 months later. At this time, well over 1 million, or 1 in 4 of Irish-born people, were living in America. Many, like Gralton, had American citizenship.
I remember when he first came home, I never saw him until June bonfire night 1921, I think it was. And we were having a bonfire at our lane, and he came on in a horse and car from the Sna station. His brother-in-law was driving him, and they stopped. He went up to see my grandmother, who was his aunt, and he paid a visit to her, and I liked him from the beginning. He was very nice to us children, and he paid a short visit and he went on home then. And after that then, the hall in Gowl was burdened by the Black and Tans, and they started negotiations about building a new hall, and he was involved in it, and they didn't want to give him much say in it. So he decided to build a hall on his own land then. And he got a piece of land from the father. And he said he'd get labour, and he'd give the land, and they'd get free labour, a lot of free labour, and the neighbours all chipped in and built this big hall. It was the biggest around the country at the time. It was all done with ceiling boards in, so there were a lot of windows in it. I forget how many windows now. And there was a little stage on the right as you go in, where they had concerts and things. And then there was a dais for the bands over in front of the door. I remember it as well as if it was yesterday. And to start that one big dance, the first one. And they came from all over Longford and everywhere for it. It was a great success.
The hall was used for dances, it was used for Irish classes, it was used for various things that would be of value, educational, more or less.
There was no such thing as, techs around that time, technical schools. And he started woodwork classes and art classes and music, taught music. He brought a lot of instruments from America with him. He brought a violin, an accordion, and a gramophone. It was the first gramophone around the country. And he had all the great records, Caruso and John McCormick, all Harry Lauder. We used to love to hear them because they were the only, it was only gramophone was around the country at the time. And he played those in the hall. The priests, they were mad with him building this hall, and they've said it off the altar, and that any horse that draws sand or stones to it they wouldn't live, they die within the year. But none of them died.
Land hunger and agitation for land had a long tradition in Leitrim, but this also led to conflict when reforms yielded little for the small farmer and labourer.
By 1914, 2/3 of Irish farmers have entered into arrangements which are going to lead to them being the sole owners of their own land. That means that we now have a stable, strong, Catholic rural bourgeoisie, middle farming community established in the countryside, who therefore in some respects have an ambiguous attitude, even a critical and hostile attitude, to those Catholic nationalist farmers who have not gained so much from the progress of land reform and who are still hungry for land. Agricultural labourers, small farmers who feel that this whole social revolution has left them out.
There would be plenty of problems down the years, you see, as what was known as grabbers. People, because some fellow was down and out maybe and they had a few bob, they grabbed his land and paid maybe the rent for it or paid somehow landlord for it. And there was these courts set up by Jimmy Gralton, people's courts, in the hall while there was no law nor order during the truce. And people who had a grievance and were able to make a case that their land was wrongly taken and years gone past, brought the case to the Gralton Hall. And then the people who were running the country then were Republican people. There wasn't anything else there. That would be mainly during the truce. And there was a lot of people who had them sort of grievances, brought it there and got it rectified to a great extent. Now, at that time there was always a hunger in Leitrim for land. And where there was any estate in it that was sizable, there was a demand by the people for to break it up and for to give a more sizable farm to some fellow that he had. And what happened, he gave up his farm to his neighbour, which made his neighbour's farm bigger, and he got a bigger farm in the estate. And them were the sort of things that Jimmy Gralton was, for the short time that he had at his disposal, was the sort of thing that he was doing in the hall.
Through the efforts of the Gowel Land Committee, of which Mr. James Gralton, who was recently arrested and released, and Mr. John Mulhern are members, many land disputes which British and local arbitration courts failed to settle have been ended on very favourable terms. The farm at Lismoyle, held by a Mr. Gray, has been secured on... Their efforts for peace and the general betterment of the working classes and others are well known, and the success of their energies is commendable, for they have been constant in their endeavours to tackle and settle one of the most thorny subjects locally in the national struggle. Would there were many of their class throughout Ireland.
The Gralton Court, as it was known, was just one of many local courts that flourished during the War of Independence.
Originally they were spontaneous committees, leaders of the community anxious not to see the land agitation which had begun again in the west, particularly with the shortage of grazing land and land being handed out by the congested district boards. That was the beginnings of them. They set up their own small committees to deal with it.
So you can see Sinn Féin when it suits it, playing the card of the agrarian left wing, and when it suits it a few months later playing the card of the agrarian right wing. And that's quite understandable, because the broad reasons for the emergence of Sinn Féin are political, not agrarian. They're to do with the reaction to the executions of the risings, the fear of conscription. These are broad political emotions which sweep the whole island of Ireland, and the land question plays in different ways in different localities.
So they were local courts, centred in the community, lay judges elected by members of the community.
There was always a demand for a break-up of this estate, and for it be divided up on people who had no land or who had small farms. And usually what happened was that what we done as IRA, I mean, we drove the cattle off the land. Cattle would be put in there belonging to anybody and paid for to the landlord or the landlord's agent. And we would drive them out at night, in the middle of the night, and let them wander around the roads any place, and the guards would have to collect them next day. And when they'd be back again, we would drive them again.
There was no law and order in Ireland that time. He set up these courts in the hall, and he presided over them with a committee. And they passed their opinion, the committee, and he sanctioned it or didn't sanction it then. And they passed a good few laws, which were kept on after the truce was over, when the law and order came back again.
The situation in Leitrim was approaching anarchy, with land squatting and cattle driving the main weapons of ranch break-up.
There isn't any doubt that the time of these Irish Times leaders on agrarian Bolshevism in the spring of 1920, that there is a growing fear, not just being promoted by the Unionists. The Irish Times at that time is a Unionist paper, and in a way what it is doing is saying to nationalist Ireland and the strong farmers of Ireland, which the Irish Times well knows existed, are an important force, it's saying to them, look at the forces you've unleashed. Are you sure you're happy about this? Are you sure about this land hunger? A lot of it may be directed at the moment against remaining landlord interests, small though they are, but soon it will be directed against you. Are you sure that you want to live in a Bolshevik Ireland? That's the type of argument that's been developed, and it's quite clear that the Catholic hierarchy and sections of Sinn Féin become very nervous in response to that sort of argument, and you are getting a sensitivity which grows throughout the following year within Sinn Féin, to eventually a conviction in the summer of 21 that Sinn Féin's really got to crack down on agrarian radicalism. At the end of the day, it's going to have to strike a balance. And the balance that's struck is the balance that's struck in the summer of 21, when it finally starts to lean very heavily on the, for example, the Mayo cattle drivers, who are, in the words of the leading Republican from Mayo, Sean Boyd, and later on a Fianna Fáil minister, are cleaned up by the Mayo IRA. And we can be sure that being cleaned up by the Mayo IRA was not a gentle process in the summer of 1921.
Gralton's activities were increasingly disapproved of by the pro-treaty IRA.
But he had to fly the country then. They got the police after him again, and he had to fly the country again. They came and arrested him, to arrest him in the hall one night. He went out the window and went away, and he went to Kildare station and went back to America. Hugh Gralton and Tom Gralton, they drove him in a horse and car to Drumsna station. There was a station up there at that time, and when they were going across the bridge, he had to fly. So when they were going across the bridge, some of them gave the horse a clip, and he started to rear up. And Jimmy jumped down and he went the other side. The army was on the bridge, but he went the other side of the horse, and they never saw him. And when he went across the bridge again, he got up again and it was off. They never saw him. So that's how he got. And he stayed in a man's house up near Kildare that night, and he took the train back for America the next morning.
Gralton left for America and did not come back for 10 years. In 1932, just months after the first Fianna Fáil victory in the general election, Jimmy Gralton returned to Efferna in Leitrim.
The place was lined up all over the place with what was known as the CID, the Civil Investigation Department of the police. And they were thuggy sort of people who would batter and rough stuff, raid houses and beat up Republicans, particularly people who they might think they might get information from it by beating them up. There was that sort of an atmosphere that existed there, and there was men in that area were on the run until 1932. Now, Jimmy Gralton couldn't have survived there. He was in America, but as soon as there was a lease of life seen, or thought of a lease of life, he returned from America. As soon as the election in 1932, when De Valera was elected.
De Valera was not a social radical in the sense in which we would now understand the term. He did not seek to overthrow the structures of society. He wasn't subversive socially in that sense. But many of his enemies regarded him as socially revolutionary because they identified him with the Civil War, of course. And many of the pro-treaty supporters in the Civil War regarded the anti-treaty forces as motivated by social revolutionary ideals, that they wanted to upset or to overthrow the existing structure of society. So Dev, in a sense, was imagined to be more radical than he was. And it is true that he was a reformer. He was a social reformer rather than a social radical. He did believe in a welfare state of some sort. He believed in better old age pensions, pensions for the blind, widows' pensions, unemployment benefits. And these things at the time were regarded as revolutionary by many of the property classes in Irish society.
He opened up the hall again, and still they didn't want it. There was spoke out against it again, and they were very much against it, the clergy and I suppose the politicians too. And it was fired into one night when there was a dance going on, and there were shots fired into it to warn them, I suppose. And his sister, the nun, and another nun, there were two nuns home for the Eucharistic Congress, and they visited the hall a couple of times to hear the music. But Father O'Dowd had a chat with her anyhow, and after Father O'Dowd had the chat with her, she never went back into the hall again, except the night she was going back, or the night she was going back, she just called to the door to say goodbye to him. And she put her arms around him and kissed him, and she was talking to my husband then, Patrick, after, and she says, "Patrick, what are they doing to our James?" She was heartbroken. "What are they doing to James?" she says.
Gralton had joined Fianna Fáil when he came back, seeing it as the only practical organisation that might get things done.
And when he came back to Effern, or where he was, his hall wasn't working. And there was no Labour Party in it, there was no Communist Party, and there was no Labour Party in it. And there was nothing then only Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil. And Fianna Fáil was a pretty progressive organisation at the time, particularly local branches. And Fianna Fáil, who would be interested in roads and jobs of work and division of land to a great extent. And he joined the local branch, the Drumsna branch of the Fianna Fáil party, in order to get things done. Now, that was his idea in joining Fianna Fáil. There was nothing else he could do.
He was, however, forced to resign.
I think he'd resigned. I think he knew he had heard he was going to be expelled, and he resigned. Ben Maguire was the TD here at that time, and he knew he was going to be expelled. And he formed the Revolutionary Workers' Group here, and he went to a meeting in Longford. They had a big meeting in Longford, and after that meeting, then they were down on a site because the bishop got after the bishops. He lived in Longford, and he got after him for this Revolutionary Workers' Group. So Patrick joined in that too. And when Patrick went to get married, then years after we went to get married, he had to go to Father O'Dowd, and he held him for a couple of hours to try to get him to promise he would resign from the Revolutionary Workers' Group and the IRA as well. He was in the IRA as well, and Patrick wouldn't give in. So he finally had to give him his papers.
Increasing anti-communist hysteria had been built up and maintained since the early 30s.
You see, Cumann and Gael ran a Red Scare campaign against De Valera in 31, partly because they were scratching the barrel for arguments used against him. They knew the wind was in his sails. They knew they were heading for electoral defeat unless they could whip up some sort of panic reaction among the voters. And a Red Scare is a classic clue to the barrenness of your arguments in every other area, because most voters most of the time vote on economic issues, on bread and butter issues, which is what happened in 1932 also. I mean, De Valera won the 32 election, or Fianna Fáil greatly improved its position, largely because of the economic depression in the country. Ireland didn't suffer from the great slump as badly as several other European countries, because it wasn't as industrialised as they were, but it did suffer. And so many of those who were suffering economic hardship swung to Fianna Fáil. And Cumann and Gael could see this happening. They couldn't counter Fianna Fáil's attraction, or the attraction of its economic policies. So when you're bereft of argument like that, you try and run up some sort of scare, and the Red Scare was conveniently to hand.
Patrick's sisters and brothers, they were always getting hints, even when the priest had come to the school. And if they didn't know their lesson, "Oh, I suppose you were dancing in the hall last night," this kind of talk. And the children, when the children would have a row with you, call you socialists. We weren't so much, because our name wasn't Gralton, you see, I was Scotland. But Patrick's brothers and sisters were Gralton, you see, and they were near the hall, but I was a mile or so away from it. I didn't get that much to taunt, but they did.
De Valera explicitly refuted the allegations of communist help or influence in his pre-election speeches, whilst Cumann and Gael tried to enlist the support of the church in 1931.
So the next thing you see is the cabinet, somewhat panicked, I suspect, meeting in July and passing a resolution calling for a dossier on the revolutionary threat to be prepared and submitted to the Cardinal McCrory, and that a meeting should be arranged then between cabinet ministers and the hierarchy in an attempt to bring the church on side in the battle against incipient communism, as the cabinet imagined. That's quite an interesting development, because I think what's happening here is that the cabinet is taking the initiative in mobilising the hierarchy in the struggle against communism.
My Lord Bishop, my colleagues and I have been watching for some time with grave anxiety the rapid growth in the country of subversive... I have the honour to send to your Lordship herewith a memorandum on the situation, together with copies of certain documents referred to therein. I have the honour to be your Lordship's most obedient humble servant, Liam T. McCosgrave.
This dossier that had been called for in July was produced, and on the strength of that, this was drawn up in fact by the Garda Commissioner Owen O'Duffy, who was vehemently anti-communist. I mean, the man saw reds around every corner, and he was the sort of man who would have used a sledgehammer to crack a nut. On the basis of what O'Duffy told the cabinet about the strength of the communist threat, the cabinet introduced the Constitution Amendment number 17 bill, which actually gave the government the authority to bring in military tribunals which could impose the death penalty, and to ban any organisations that they decided threatened the state, threatened the security of the state. This bill was discussed for 3 days in the Dáil and then passed. It was supported by, obviously the government party supported it. Fianna Fáil opposed it simply on the grounds that they believed there was sufficient legislation to do with the threat, and Labour opposed it on the same grounds. In other words, there was no principled opposition to the bill within the Dáil. A couple of days after the bill was passed, you have the Bishop's pastoral, which calls for Catholic offensive action against the communist threat. And 2 days after that, the government actually then brings in a list of prescribed organisations, where they prescribe Serera, the IRA, all these front organisations.
The Eucharistic Congress of 1932 gave De Valera an enhanced respectability.
The timing of the Eucharistic Congress was very fortunate from De Valera's point of view. It was a very happy coincidence that it was scheduled to occur within a couple of months of his coming into office. And of course, because he had been presented as anti-clerical, and indeed was resented and feared by many of the bishops. There were very few Fianna Fáil bishops in 1932. It gave him a golden opportunity to, in a sense, project himself as the loyal son of Rome in religious terms, and as a representative of an overwhelmingly Catholic people, which of course the people of the Free State were at that particular stage. So he seized the opportunity offered. Of course, he was seen in the company of the Apostolic Nuncio, of all these senior ecclesiastics, time and again. He rendered homage at a religious level, and at the same time he preserved his political independence. So in a way it allowed him come in from the cold in terms of perceptions of him in certain circles as being anti-Catholic and anti-clerical, and at the same time compromised him on nothing as far as Fianna Fáil's policies were concerned.
Although the physical force anarchy which had ruled in the early 20s was now gone, a rejuvenated IRA sometimes took part in operations to restore evicted tenants.
Now, there were evictions that had taken place in the 10 years previous, and as soon as there was a change of government, it didn't stop at that as the result of some landlords who thought they might get away with it. But there was this particular place in North Roscommon. It would be on the Earl of Kilronan or Earl of Kingston estate on the Roscommon-Leitrim border. And there was a man and his wife who were evicted from their cottage, a man named Millamo and his wife and 2 little kids. Now, the IRA in Roscommon numerically were pretty weak, and we in Leitrim were pretty strong. We had hundreds of men. We had practically at that time maybe between Cumnamun and Fina and IRA not too far off 1,000 men. Now, they asked us, the Roscommon people, to go down and give them a hand to put them back. So we went there of a Sunday, and we got Millamo and his wife and brought their bed out and put it up on a cart and put them sitting on the top of their bed on a little bit of a table or press or whatever they had with us, and we marched with bicycles behind for about a mile behind the horse and cart until we turned up the avenue up to the big house. And the cottage was there inside of the gate. It was boarded up, the windows and doors, and chains, iron bars across it. And there was instructions given for to break down the chains and the boards.
So they asked Jimmy to go down with them because he was a great talker. They wanted to make a speech or something, and they brought Jimmy down with them. So they did reinstate him anyhow, and they got Jimmy to make a speech after, and he was never put out again. That was Millmo. Some of them is there yet, the crowd.
Now there was 3 of the officers of the IRA who went up to the house and knocked on the door, and brought the agent out and put him on his knees, put 2 guns under his ear, 2 revolvers under his ears, and one man standing in front of them, and gave him his warning what was to happen if Millamo was ever turned out. But Gralton happened to be there. He went down along with Packy Gralton, and he seen what happened. And when the lads came back, he said, "Well, look, boys," he said, "I think you have done a great job of work to reinstate this man and his wife and kids. But I think what you want to do is to hold a public meeting now around here and explain to the people that the fight of 10 years ago, the fight against the black and tans and their clearing of them out of this island, or this part of the island, meant nothing except to change the colour of the flag. Those who own the land then still own it." Well, now, you had to live a long time before you could remember what he said. I don't forget what he said because I know he said the truth. But there was men there as old as Gralton. They never answered him. There was nothing done. They didn't believe in holding meetings. They believed in shooting a landlord, but not in political education, the same as Gralton did believe in, which would save hassle, would save shooting, save many things if people knew the direction in which they should march.
De Valera called a snap election for January 1933, and despite opposition tactics and scaremongering, got his first overall majority. His politics of stability in moderation, combined with elements of social reform, had paid off.
I think De Valera did strive to reassure what I would call middle opinion in the opposition, moderate opinion in the opposition, that he was not going to be a raving lunatic, that he was not going to be striving to overthrow law and order, that he was not going to seek revenge above all for the Civil War, which of course they were terrified of. And therefore he appointed Frank Aiken as a relatively conciliatory Minister for Defence to keep the army on side, and he appointed James Geoghegan, who actually had been a Cumann and Wales supporter, as Minister for Justice. And there was no, I suppose, no surer way of trying to reassure the frightened and the fearful in the opposition of the legality of De Valera's approach now towards the use of power, than to appoint, in a sense, one of their own as his Minister for Justice.
On the 3rd of February 1933, the outgoing Minister for Justice, Geoghegan, issued a deportation order against Gralton as an undesirable alien. He had to be out of the country by the 4th of March.
Some of the most vehement denunciations of communism that we see in this period are actually coming from Labour Party branches. I remember the branch in Enniscorthy, for instance, described communists as perverts. And there were calls by various Labour Party branches for an all-out war against communism and the communist menace, the communist threat. This hysteria built up. Now, obviously, I mean, the hysteria, the attacks, the vehemence coming from the Catholic Church was even worse. And you had bishops calling for not only vigilance, but you even had Cardinal McCrory calling for Catholics to prepare for trouble. The anti-communist hysteria really came to a head, I think, in the early part of 1933. And a lot of this was inspired by the Lenten pastorals of that time. Just to give you a flavour of some of it. I mean, here you have the Bishop of Killaloe, for instance, talking of the life and death struggle in which the church will suffer many losses. You have the Bishop of Kildare urging his flock to be prepared to fight. There's no reason why anyone who undertakes to propagate communism should be allowed to do so. I mean, this is instigating violence, obviously. The Bishop of Derry called on his flock to clear out the foreign agitators. And the Bishop of Kilmore said that communism was out to nationalise women and children. So, I mean, you have this constant tirade against communism. It's widespread, it's national, it's getting a lot of media attention, it's published in all the newspapers. And this culminates in March 1933 in a sermon in the Pro Cathedral in Dublin, a vehemently anti-communist sermon. Now, it seems that there were organised gangs attending that particular service, a group called the Animal Gang, and they led the congregation from the Pro Cathedral to the communist headquarters. Of course, it still wasn't the Communist Party, it's still the Revolutionary Workers' Groups at this time, Connolly House. And they lay siege to Connolly House for 3 days and 3 nights, eventually setting fire to a bedding factory next door, which catches into Connolly House, and the place is destroyed. And the occupants have to flee over the rooftops. Now, they defended it as best they could by knocking down walls internally and using the bricks to hurl at the mob outside, who were singing hymns, and there were priests and everything there. And the police stood back and watched this. I mean, this is the other interesting thing. The Gardaí just stood back and watched.
I could see the crowd out in the street, and they had lit a bonfire with the books taken out of the shop window, and they were around the bonfire singing hymns and shouting and roaring. And we could see them. And the next thing, more bricks and other things came flying through the window, and now the open space of the window into where we were, about 8 of us in the room. Because we have flung all these things back, taking good aim, and there were so many that you couldn't miss, so we inflicted quite a lot of damage on our enemies at that time. But they had come down, I was told afterwards, from a mission somewhere in Dublin. That's a religious mission. The Lenten period, and they all came down, led by a priest with his muffler around his collar. And a lot of them had catcher cases full of bricks and stones and weapons. It was a concerted attack, and this went on for a long time. The police just looked on. They were more or less sympathetic to the mob, and then the mob got the bright idea. There was still a lot of stabling, horse traffic at that time round there, and they took straw and things from the stables, piled it against the front door and any wooden places they could see, and set fire to it.
What was nothing less than a pitched battle raged in Dublin last night for many hours, when a crowd of upwards of 2,000 attempted to destroy Connolly House. Pistol shot sounded at a window, but went unheeded. The smoke of a second shot was seen. Then 2 more shots were fired. The crowd that now filled the street angrily drew the attention of the police to the firing.
They were singing hymns. Faith of Our Fathers was the top of the charts as far as they were concerned. And they were singing this really, in between swearing and cursing and roaring, go back to Russia, you red bastard, you know.
The Lenten pastorals of the time took an extreme attitude to any left-wing sentiments.
Venerable Archdeacon P. Donoghue, VF, preaching in Carrick-on-Shannon and Gowl churches yesterday, said it was sad to think that some Irishmen had been gulled into participation in the diabolical propaganda at Carrick-on-Shannon, Gowl and Drumsna Catholic churches on Sunday. The parish priest denounced the effort to propagate communism in this country. They were dealing with the references to this evil in the pastoral of the learned and distinguished Bishop of Ardagh and Clonmacnoise, Most Reverend Dr. McNamee, D.D.
Even dances and dance halls were looked on as occasions of danger and sin. When the time of the deportation order's enforcement came up, the Gardaí went to Gralton's home.
He was putting on a new roof on the house. It was only a thatched roof, and he was putting a galvanised roof over the thatch. And they were clearing away the thatch, and there was holes in the roof. And the police came with the deportation order. So he said, I have to go up to get my clothes. So he went upstairs. He had a little bedroom upstairs. That was where we lived. And he went up. I said, I have to get my clothes. So he went up to get his clothes. And he went out through this hole in the roof and away down the fields. And they were waiting there for him to come back. He never came back. So he went on the run then. And he was on the run for 6 months. And Patrick took him by night, mostly, to houses far away and near and everything. The neighbours, a lot of the neighbours kept him too. And neighbours' houses was searched. And James Morrison, he was in James Morrison's house. And he used to go to James Morrison's uncle's house, Michael Gallagher's. It was just down the fields. And the guards went one day to James Morrison's, and James was in bed in the morning. And to search the house, so they searched the house, and he wasn't there. But James knew he was in his uncle's house, Michael Gallagher's, down the field a bit. And James ran in his bare feet down the field to get before them, and he warned them and got him out. And he hid him between 2 ridges of potatoes, between the stalks of the potatoes. And he hid him there until they were gone. James was one great friend of his.
For 6 months, Jimmy stayed on the run, staying with friends and hiding from the police.
This man was standing at the door, Patrick McLaughlin and the son. And it was the son told me. He was home from England. And he said, I heard, my father told me a story, he said, before he died. He said, we're standing in the door one day, and we saw a horse and cart going up with a load of straw. And Packy Gralton, that's my husband, was driving the horse. And he looked down, he said, I bet you £1 Jimmy Gralton is in that load of straw. You know, and he was in it. He brought him, that's the way he had to bring him. You know, in between the straw, that he wouldn't be seen in the daytime. So it was mostly at night he brought him, but that particular day he brought him by in the straw.
When he was on the run, to be limited the number of houses that he could be put up in, or that would be prepared to accept him. It's very hard to understand the whole question of how this Red Scare was preached off the pulpits and chapels and all that sort of stuff. For example, there would be a number of us that time wouldn't get absolution as young fellas because we were members of the IRA. And therefore, some fellow who would be branded as a communist, it was much more difficult. And there was people who might say nothing, but at the same time they weren't prepared to stick their noses out and say, I'm 100% with you. It took some building up for to do that. Not easy.
A Gralton Defence Committee was set up.
3 chairs were raised for Gralton and for the Irish Workers' Republic. A collection realised £8 3 shillings. A statement issued on behalf of the IRA says, this organisation has no hesitation in emphatically condemning the action taken by the 26th county government against Gralton. And we propose to do what we can in helping to prevent this outrage from being consummated.
In reality, a majority of the people were against him. The IRA, although officially neutral, wanted nothing to do with him. Padre O'Donnell brought a group of speakers to Drumsna village for an open-air after-mass meeting.
Paddy came down with 2 friends. I think one of them was Lyle Donaghy. I think they sent for him to come down to speak for him, to try to get a trial for him. And he came down. They had advertised a meeting for Mass on Sunday outside here at Drumsna. There was an old tree that was knocked down there, an old stump of a tree. And Father Cosgrove didn't say Mass that morning. He had another priest to say Mass. And he came out on the altar then when they arrived. They arrived just before Mass was over, and he told them that the anti-God men had arrived and not to listen to them. So they came out anyhow from Mass, and it seems they were listening to him, some of them. And William O'Cran, he was a returned American too. He was very friendly with Jimmy, and he had promised him he'd speak, he'd introduce him at Drumsna. He used to come to Drumsna Mass. So he was getting up on the tree to introduce him. And Father Cosgrave shouted at him, "You get down," he said, or you'll be the next one for Waterloo." That meant he'd be deported too. So McCran got cold feet and went away, and Patrick got up then to introduce him. And he says to peg them. So the more started pegging the stones and sods of turf and everything at them. And they abandoned the meeting anyhow. And they got into the car and went off down the town in the Torrent and came back out to Effron. They were to hold a meeting at Gowell Church that day too. But with the reception they got in Drumsna, they didn't hold any meeting. They held a meeting in Patrick's father's house.
A meeting had been arranged to follow 9 o'clock Mass. Father Cosgrave told the congregation that an anti-God meeting was to be held and advised them to go home. Padre O'Donnell got up to speak as the congregation came out. Father Cosgrave deflected the crowd away from the speaker, who had now begun to speak. The crowd did not go away, but were within earshot. Father Cosgrave then called to them to come on and tear down the priest speaker. Is only the spearhead of the attack. The real attack springs from the memory of the campaign Gralton led in 1922 on land questions in the area.
The priest, old Father Cosgrave, led the thing. Now, nothing happened as regards that, but there was all that sort of an attitude to people who would be speaking on behalf of Jimmy Gralton. To be almost impossible to hold a meeting of protest. Because there was people just didn't know. It was different from now.
In the Gralton thing as well, I think that's right, that the mainstream of the IRA, as I said, had their fingers burned by the Sarah era experience. They had never before had the church turn against them in such a vehement fashion, and that really scared them. Because I suppose most of the people who supported the IRA were good Catholics. So the Sarah era thing frightened them off, and when the Gralton deportation order came up and the communists tried to organise some sort of support for Gralton, the IRA as a body had nothing to do with it. Padre O'Donnell, true to form, did. I mean, Padre O'Donnell, probably more than any other individual, came to Gralton's assistance.
Ben Maguire, the local Fianna Fáil TD, said of Gralton,
"Deportation of an Irishman requires investigation, but deportation of a person propagating English ideas was a desirable thing."
Local councillors were equally unsympathetic.
At Leitrim County Council meeting, Mr N. Carter, chairman, presiding, a mass of documents was laid before the members from the Leitrim Irish Republican Club, County Kilkenny Men's Association, Irish Group Anti-Imperialistic League, Mr Mooney, United Brotherhood of... I suggest we should get Hitler over here for a few days. In reply to Mr Keaveney, the chairman said that Gralton's father was attended by a priest prior to his death. Mr Mooney strongly recommended that any communistic literature sent to the council in future should be destroyed and not brought before the meeting again.
In August, after 6 months on the run, Gralton was captured.
Someone gave way on him and told him where he was. He was over at Garb at Brain's room, and he was there, and he was up in the room in bed when the guards came at night, and they knew he was there. They were told, and told exactly where he was. It was planned and all. I heard lately it was planned and all, and they told where he was, and they went up in the room and got him, and they brought him straight to the boat. They never, I think they called it Carrick Barracks, but they never gave him a change of clothing, never let him see his mother, spirited him off away to Cove. And Patrick and John Byrne went in right away. They heard right away that he was caught. And Patrick, they cycled into Carrick right away to the barrack, and he was gone when they went in. He was spirited away right away. Patrick was very close to him, and he sold cattle for him, and he gave him the money, and he didn't want to take the money, £20, and Jimmy he gave it to him, and that money was taken for his passage. He was a pitiful looking case when he landed in New York. His great friend Gerald O'Reilly met him, and another. You have the picture there of where they met him. And he was a pitiful looking case. He says coming down the gangplank with this old shirt on him, old jacket thrown over his shoulders that he had been, I suppose, lying in and for maybe a month or 2 weeks, because they wouldn't allow him. And he was spotless. He was very clean.
He was deported from Cove on the same day as O'Duffy's Blue Shirt March on Dublin was banned by De Valera. The split that had been looming for some time within the IRA came some months after Jimmy's deportation with the founding of the Republican Congress.
We found too that one tactic of the IRA leadership was when there was something happening in the situation in Dublin and elsewhere, when we should have been out in the streets demonstrating and opposing the blue shirts and so on, they would call a parade indoors always. So it took us off the streets when we should have been out on the streets. And this and other things showed how indeed reactionary they were. And then a number of us said, well, we've had enough of this nonsense, and from now on we're going to take an active part, social part in the thing as revolutionary workers movement. So led by Peadar O'Donnell, Frank Ryan, George Gilmore, Mick Price and others, it was more or less agreed that something should be done. It took the form of calling a convention in Athlone, at which 200 IRA officers attended and a number of other prominent people in the labour movement. And it was decided then to issue a call for a Republican Congress, which would create a united front of all forces opposed to fascism in Ireland and working for a democratic socialist republic.
Despite many protests in Ireland and America, Gralton was never allowed to set foot in Ireland again.
The Secretary, Department of External Affairs. I beg to acknowledge receipt of your minute 8619 of the 11th instant regarding James Gralton. This man's name has been placed on our visa blacklist, and all other offices notified. On Rooney, Roinganohi, Coigracha. With reference to previous correspondence 8619 regarding James Gralton, an American, I am directed by the Minister for Justice to inform you that this man was deported from Cove on the 13th ultimo. The Minister desires that Gralton should not be allowed to re-enter the...
He died on the 29th of December, 1945, in Bellevue Hospital in New York. The hall was shot into and finally burnt to the ground on Christmas Eve 1932. A plaque now stands on the site.
We brought home this fella. He was very hard up and he had no place to sleep, so he took him in. And when he woke up in the morning, he was gone with his trousers and his money. So that was the story of his life. I always thought he would come back. That's the truth. I have a bit of a letter there that he wrote to me before we got married, and he said, I'll come back to see you one day. But he never did.
The priest was loud. "Follow Gralton or follow Christ," he roared. "Good people of Drumsna, remember our Lord and the way he died for all men. Gralton is a socialist. Socialism is another name for communism. Is it Christ or Gralton in transcendent Leitrim?" "Gralton by Christ," an old man said. Gralton escaped to New York. One night, he found a beggar in the streets, took him home, gave him food and drink, a bed. When Gralton woke, the beggar was gone. So were Gralton's money and clothes. Not for the first time, Gralton was naked.